Everything seemed as normal on the fourth day of joint maneuvers in eastern Poland. The cold was cutting through the countryside, the routine was exhausting, and the soldiers were used to the constant tension of the exercises. But that morning, a group was deployed for a drill that wasn't on the official schedule. Different equipment, vague instructions, and a strange smell in the air. One of the men began to show unusual reactions a few hours later. Nothing visibly alarming, at least at first. But it only took 2 days for the whole platoon to realize something about that exercise had crossed the line, and one of them simply never came back. In November 1967, military units from 6 countries gathered in eastern Poland for a joint training exercise focusing on silent warfare, a term used to simulate situations without heavy weaponry, where soldiers' psychological endurance was tested to the extreme. Temperatures were below zero, and camps were set up in forested areas close to the border with Belarus. The operation was codenamed Grey Mist and was surrounded by secrecy. Hardly anyone outside the command had any details about the real objectives of the drill. The American platoon was one of the first to arrive, under the command of Captain Howard McKay. Among the men was Travis Moore, a 24-year-old from Missouri with a background in chemical reconnaissance and an impeccable record. He was known for his calmness, obedience, and above-average intelligence. His colleagues trusted him, and many followed him even outside formal orders. At the time, Travis was the kind of soldier the manuals would use as an example. Everything went according to plan until the 3rd day. That's when orders came through to move part of the contingent to an isolated area without maps or signs. All the sergeant said was that it was a test of response to unexpected elements. Without further details, the soldiers followed. The command silence was accepted as part of the staging. After all, psychological training depended on it, creating tension with as little information as possible. But that night, it wasn't an act. The deployment took place shortly after midnight. The orders came on letterhead, with the signature of the Polish major responsible for logistics, but some noticed that the handwriting seemed to have been forged. Even so, no one questioned it. Questioning meant delaying the mission, and at the time, delays could be interpreted as serious failures. The group, made up of 12 soldiers, set off in silence, crossing a frozen trail to an area of dense forest with dark trees and no sign of human presence. When they reached the marked point, they found metal boxes with masks, special uniforms, and a small generator. The only clear instruction read, "Put on full equipment. Do not remove until further notice." One of the soldiers, Corporal Ellison, even said that it looked more like a nuclear test scene than any conventional exercise, but nobody paid any attention. Protocol demanded obedience, and the tension of the moment only increased the alertness among them. At around 2:45 a.m., the generator was switched on. A low hum filled the air, and a light mist began to spread around the area. At first, it just looked like water vapor, but as the minutes passed, the metallic smell became evident. It wasn't tear gas, or any of the compounds used in NATO training. The mist gradually darkened, and the men began to look at each other in silence, uncomfortable. Travis was the only one who remained completely still. Travis Moore was positioned in the center of the group. His colleagues' reports indicate that he stared into the mist as if he recognized something in it. It was a subtle detail, but it was noticeable. While the others were moving, adjusting themselves or whispering, Travis didn't react. He didn't even blink very often. When Sergeant Hicks approached him to ask if he was all right, Travis only replied, "You're closer than you should be." The sentence made no sense at all, but it was said with such conviction that no one dared to laugh. Over the next few hours, Travis began to show signs of mild disorientation. He spoke less, was slow to respond to simple commands, and, for a moment, even repeated an order in Russian, even though he had never studied the language. The sergeant considered removing him from the operation, but as his behavior posed no immediate risk, he preferred to wait until the end of the simulation. After all, this could be a specific psychological test, and acting prematurely could put everyone in a bad position with the command. At 04:17, something finally broke protocol. Travis collapsed on his feet, without any warning, as if his body had simply shut down. The men held him before he fell to the icy ground. The mask was still on his face, but his eyes were open, fixed on the dark sky. An ambulance was called by radio, but there was interference for almost 20 minutes. When the signal finally came back, the base officers ordered no one to move until a medical escort arrived. This was no longer an exercise. Travis was taken back to the base by a medical team wearing full containment suits, the same ones used in situations of contamination by unknown agents. It was too strange a scene to be part of an act. The other soldiers were given no explanation. They were simply instructed to remain isolated for 48 hours in a makeshift tent, with portable heaters and cold rations. No one slept that night. The silence was only interrupted by a static radio that insisted on failing. At 3:26 a.m., the silence was broken by a scream. It came from the medical ward about 400 meters from the camp. It was long, hoarse, and desperate. The soldiers looked at each other. They knew by instinct whose voice it was. The scream lasted almost 40 seconds. After that, nothing else. No sound, no footsteps, just the wind hitting the tent's tarpaulins. The group commander told them to ignore it. It's the effect of the gas. He's confused. It will pass. But no one believed him. The next morning, when they were released from isolation, the soldiers asked to see Travis. The request was refused. A Polish captain informed them that the soldier was under observation and had been transferred to a safer location. He's fine. Don't worry. The sentence was said with such rigidity that it became suspicious. When the soldiers returned to the training camp, they realized that all the equipment they had used the night before had disappeared. There were no more boxes, masks, or generators, just dirt and tire tracks, as if nothing had happened there. On the second day after the incident, the Alpha platoon received permission to resume part of their training, but with a reduced number of men. Travis's absence began to weigh on the group. Corporal Ellison tried to keep morale high, but some soldiers were visibly upset. Comments began to circulate in low voices. He was strange before the gas. He looked like he already knew. Nobody goes out like that. Fear, doubt, and anger began to take hold of the camp. In the late afternoon, 2 soldiers from the surveillance guard, Benson and Kravitz, reported seeing someone standing outside the supply depot. They said it was Travis. He was wearing the standard uniform, but his hood was down, and his face, according to them, looked drained. They couldn't explain it. When the officers went to check, there was no one at the scene. The report was dismissed as a hallucination due to fatigue, but Sergeant Hicks ordered the night guard to be stepped up anyway. Hours later, the command ordered all soldiers to wear containment masks during the next exercises, including in open areas. The official justification was a possible accidental release of test substances, but for those who were there that night, it only sounded like confirmation of what they feared most. The gas was not part of the training. And Travis, maybe he wasn't just sick. Maybe he was already contaminated by something none of them knew about. On the morning of the 6th day, 2 soldiers from Alpha Platoon were taken to the clinic with symptoms similar to those Travis had shown in the first few hours: mild disorientation, loss of recent memory, and unusual behavior, described as too distant to be conscious, but too alert to be asleep. One of them, Private Reynolds, was found walking barefoot through the field, even though the ground was covered in snow, repeating nonsense phrases. The other, Shaw, was alternately crying and laughing, without explanation. The base's medical authorities, led by a Hungarian captain called Ferenc Gabor, attributed the symptoms to delayed reactions to the extreme stress of training. But the men knew there was something more. None of them had ever seen Reynolds or Shaw give in to stress. They were experienced soldiers, used to pressure, and the fact that they had both taken part directly in the gas exercise only added to the suspicion among their colleagues. No one said anything out loud, but everyone was beginning to fear for themselves. By the end of the day, the mood inside the base was one of growing paranoia. The mere sight of a comrade scratching his eyes or walking more slowly generated suspicious looks. Trust between the soldiers was rapidly eroding. Even the most skeptical began to sleep in masks. Some locked their tents from the inside. The Alpha platoon, once cohesive, was now fragmented, each man locked in his own fear. hoping that at any moment it would be his turn to change. Travis remained in total isolation for 5 days after the incident. None of his colleagues were able to see him in person. Only the base's chief medical officer, a retired French colonel called Lucien Devereux, had direct access to the special ward set up in the research wing. It was he who, during a private dinner among officers, uttered a phrase that sparked an even greater alarm among those present. "If he didn't have dog tag, I'd swear he's not the same man anymore." According to later reports from a local nurse, Travis didn't sleep. He simply kept his eyes open, even when he wasn't responding to stimuli. He would spend hours completely still, then walk around the room alone, muttering things in a low voice. On one occasion, he was found writing symbols on a piece of paper with automatic movements, as if he didn't even know what he was doing. The papers were confiscated and never seen again. The symbols were said to resemble archaic Slavic characters, something Travis certainly didn't know. On the 6th day, Colonel Devereux ordered all the lights in the infirmary to remain on 24 hours a day. When asked, he simply replied, "Because he looks different in the dark." The tone in which he said it sent a chill down the spine of those present. It was a simple order, but it carried a fear that was hard to disguise. From then on, Travis's image was no longer that of a sick soldier. It was treated as something that needed to be contained. During Travis's first full night in the infirmary, the reports of those on duty began to differ. The head nurse reported that he slept the whole time. A young Hungarian orderly, however, swore that he heard continuous banging on the wall for more than 2 hours. Another technician claimed to have seen shadows moving inside the room, even though Travis was restrained to the bed by restraint belts. None of this was officially recorded. On the morning shift, the team found the door locked from the inside, something considered impossible since the locking system was external. When they finally gained access to the room, Travis was out of the restraints, sitting in the corner, with what appeared to be words written on the window glass in his own blood. "It's opening," he said. Even so, his vital signs were stable, and the physical examination showed no apparent injuries. It was as if the blood had come from somewhere invisible. In view of what had happened, an urgent request was sent to the Central Command in Warsaw. The report called for the replacement of the entire staff of the medical wing and the presence of a specialist in military neurobehavior. However, the response received was even more disturbing. "Remain as you are. Superior order. Remote monitoring initiated." From that moment on, it was clear that something bigger was being covered up. The only question was how far it would go. On the 8th day at 5:12 a.m., Travis woke up abruptly. The sensors showed a sudden increase in his heart rate, as if he had woken up from a violent nightmare. But his eyes were serene, almost empty. He didn't speak. He just sat on the bed and stared straight ahead for almost an hour, without blinking, without moving a muscle. The nurse on duty, startled, called for backup. When the doctor arrived, Travis still hadn't moved. When he tried to examine him, the doctor was surprised by an unexpected reaction. Travis grabbed his wrist with extreme force. He didn't speak, he didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He just held it, firmly and continuously. The doctor's wrist remained scarred for more than 2 days, but what was most frightening was Travis's body temperature. His skin was freezing, much lower than normal. Even so, his internal signals, breathing, heartbeat, remained normal. It was as if his body was in a state between wakefulness and suspension. After this episode, visits to the room were only made with an armed escort. Soldiers were assigned exclusively to monitor Travis, in short shifts, always accompanied by a superior. The tension inside the ward became unbearable. There was the constant impression that Travis knew more than he seemed to, that on some level he was waiting for something, or someone. Photographs taken for the internal medical reports clearly show what the soldiers would later describe as Travis's new look. There was no anger. There was no fear. It was just an absolute emptiness, as if the human part of him had been switched off. No matter what anyone asked, Travis answered in the same way. He stared in silence, as if he were listening to something else, something far away, and occasionally he would smile slightly, for no reason at all. The neurological assessment sessions showed inconsistent brain patterns. Sometimes there were peaks of extreme activity, comparable to epileptic seizures, At other times, the signs were almost nil, as if the brain were in a vegetative state. The psychiatrist who evaluated the graphs went so far as to state, in a confidential report, that this does not correspond to any known form of active human consciousness. A few days later, this document disappeared from the base's archives. By the end of the second week, Travis was no longer feeding himself, nor did he sleep or appear tired. His body remained stable, almost frozen in a state of waiting. But the look, that was the worst. Everyone who looked at him for more than a few seconds said they felt something strange, as if they were being observed from the inside out, as if, behind that immobile face, there was something that shouldn't be there. In the third week after the incident, the soldiers who took part in the exercise began to report a phenomenon that at first glance seemed coincidental. As they talked to each other, they discovered that they were having similar nightmares, always involving a misty forest, metallic sounds in the distance, and a motionless figure watching them from within the fog. Some reported waking up drenched in sweat, others trembling and with slight nosebleeds. The pattern was so repetitive that it began to worry even the most skeptical. The psychologists at the base attributed the dreams to collective suggestion, fueled by the stress of the event and concern for Travis's condition. It was the most logical explanation, but it didn't convince anyone, especially when Corporal Ellison claimed to have seen the figure from the dream standing in the forest, about 80 meters from the camp. He was unable to move for several minutes until the figure disappeared into the trees. The next day, he was asked to be transferred due to emotional instability. The request was denied. The paranoia spread like an invisible infection. Some soldiers began to sleep at alternate times for fear of all falling asleep at the same time. Others began to write down their dreams in notebooks, trying to find hidden messages. The most frightening thing was that the accounts described details never shared out loud, as if they were all, in fact, connected by something none of them understood. Travis, isolated and silent, was still awake. Always awake. The base command began to receive formal requests for withdrawal and medical leave from several soldiers involved in the training. Medical reports pointed to changes in sleep, short-term memory failures, and delayed motor reactions. None of these symptoms were considered serious in isolation, but the repeated pattern drew attention. Even so, the requests were systematically filed without response. The superiors avoided talking about it, and when pressed, they simply said that orders from above prevented any movement. One of the soldiers, Specialist Kenneth Doyle, tried to send a letter to his family describing what was happening. He wrote carefully by hand, omitting technical details, but making it clear that something very wrong was happening at the base. The letter was intercepted. He was called in for a security interview, and when he left the room, he never spoke to anyone again. He spent the next few days in complete silence, sitting staring at the floor. When he finally interacted again, he said he didn't remember writing anything. This type of interference began to be repeated with other soldiers. Any attempts to record strange events or send reports outside the base resulted in interrogation sessions, often followed by behavioral changes in those involved. The platoon no longer trusted even their own officers. Meanwhile, Travis remained isolated, untouched, as if he were at the center of something that the others were only just beginning to glimpse. At the beginning of the fourth week, one of the guards assigned to watch Travis, a Canadian sergeant called Marcus Hill, began to show alarming physical symptoms. His hair began to fall out in clumps. His previously healthy skin became pale and brittle, like old paper. He said he heard metallic sounds every time he passed near the room where Travis was, as if some kind of vibration was being emitted from inside the room. His heartbeat was also altered, too slow to be normal, but stable. Marcus was removed from his post and sent to a military hospital outside the base. 3 days later, the report sent to command said that he was suffering from an accelerated degenerative condition of unknown cause. This, coupled with the fact that he had only been in contact with Travis for 48 hours, set off all the silent alarms. The fear was no longer psychological. Now, there was a concrete physical risk, and no one knew how to isolate or contain something they couldn't name. In response, the room where Travis was staying was reinforced with lead plates on the grounds of containing possible radioactive emissions. A new protocol was adopted. Soldiers could no longer approach within 3 meters of the door without a mask and full costume. Even so, every day, the same watch sergeant reported the same thing in his shift report. He's sitting down, his eyes are open, and he smiles when I pass. In the early hours of the 27th day after the incident, something happened inside room 9F, the wing where Travis was isolated. The monitoring microphone picked up unusual sounds for almost 5 minutes. They weren't screams or clear words. They were like vocalizations in a deeper tone than Travis's original voice. They sounded like someone trying to speak with their mouth full of water, or as if his throat was different. The audio was analyzed by technicians, but no recognizable frequencies were found. It was not a known language. The next morning, one of the soldiers on the night shift collapsed nervously. He claimed to have heard Travis whispering his name, not through the speakers, but directly inside his head, like a whisper inside the skull, behind the eyes. He was taken to the psychiatric ward and medicated, but before he was sedated, he said something that put everyone on alert. The voice. It wasn't his. It was as if something else was using his body to call me. His superiors classified the event as a hallucination due to sleep deprivation, but unofficially, surveillance on Travis increased. 2 civilian scientists were summoned from Moscow, both specialists in neurophysiology. Neither of them appeared in the base's official records. They came, evaluated, and left without leaving any reports. But after the visit, a silent order was put in place. Travis was no longer to be touched, questioned, or even looked in the eye. From then on, he was no longer a patient. He was an element. 2 days later, during a routine blood test, the medical team noticed something absolutely abnormal. Travis's blood was dark, black as fresh paint. The first reaction was to check if there had been an error in the collection, but the next samples showed the same color. Thicker than normal, more viscous. Oxygenation was up to standard. There were no signs of infection or chemical contamination, at least not with the known parameters. The analyses were sent to laboratories outside the base, but even before the results came back, the officers were told to destroy all the local samples. The order came from an agency that, until then, had not been part of the operation. A short, unknown acronym without a military crest. When asked, the colonel in charge simply replied, "It's no longer a medical issue. It's now a matter of international security." After this episode, any attempt to investigate what had happened to Travis was classified as insubordinate behavior. Even mentioning the blood in reports became forbidden. The name Travis Moore was removed from internal documents, replaced by a code, element 17B. The message was clear. He was no longer treated as a human being. He was a risk, a variable, an enigma that could not be divulged. At the beginning of January 1968, with the Polish winter at its height, an emergency meeting was called in an underground facility at the base. Senior American, Polish, and Soviet officials attended, a rare event, especially in the context of the Cold War. The official agenda concerned post-exposure behavioral stability, but those who attended reported tension and fear in the air. Travis's name was avoided throughout the meeting. Instead, they just said, the event. The American general in charge of the deployment suggested the immediate withdrawal of all troops involved in the original exercise, as well as the closure of the temporary base. But the Soviets were vehemently opposed. They said that the exhibition was a unique opportunity to understand an agent outside the traditional war cataloging. This caused a stalemate. The discussion got heated, and a sentence uttered by a Polish colonel was recorded in the minutes. "You think you're still in control of this. You're not. Nobody is." After 7 hours of discussion, the decision was made to keep the base active, but to divide control of the isolation wing between the 3 nations. It was a fragile agreement, stitched together out of mutual fear. None of those present trusted the other, but everyone knew that if the situation got out of hand, what could happen wouldn't just be a military incident. It would be something much worse. Travis, meanwhile, remained in the same place, sitting motionless, waiting. In the early hours of January 14th, 2 unmarked vehicles drove through the gates of the base, without being registered in the official documentation. In them, 4 men, civilian clothes, neutral expression, and a leather briefcase for each. They went straight to the isolation wing and stayed there for more than 5 hours. None of them spoke to the soldiers at the base. None of them introduced themselves. The orders were clear. No one was to interfere. The few who saw these men inside the ward report something even more disturbing. According to unofficial testimonies, one of the visitors sat face to face with Travis for more than 40 minutes. And for the first time in more than a month, Travis blinked. Afterwards, he mumbled words that were not picked up by the microphones. But everyone present swears they felt a kind of pressure in the air, as if the oxygen had become denser during their exchange. When the men left the room, they were pale. One of them vomited on the way out, even though he tried to disguise it. The next day, they were seen leaving the base without waving or talking to anyone. A few hours later, the entire internal monitoring system was replaced. New cameras, cables replaced. The old ones were burned in a makeshift container on the field. The message was clear: no one else should have access to what was being recorded inside. The week after the visit by the unidentified civilians, Travis was quietly transferred to another sector of the base, one that the soldiers didn't know existed, the so-called Room 14B. Located in one of the East Wing's underground corridors, it only appeared on old plans of the installation, dating back to 1951. It was originally a bomb shelter, but had been reinforced with double concrete and electromagnetic shielding. Few knew of its existence. Even fewer were allowed to enter. The move was made in the early hours of the morning. With the help of a highly trained team, Travis was placed in a mobile containment capsule under 3 layers of insulation. When they arrived in room 14B, the base doctors were dismissed. From then on, only external specialists would take on the case. Rumors began to circulate among the remaining soldiers. There was talk of secret tests, neurological experiments, and even attempts at controlled communication with Travis. The strangest thing was the sound. From the transfer, an almost imperceptible noise began to be heard coming from underground, something between a distant whistle and a constant hum. Technicians tried to locate the source, but were never able to isolate the sound. It was as if it was everywhere, but nowhere. Many believed it was just a structural fault. Others, more attentive, said that the sound only started when someone said the name Travis out loud. One night, one of the soldiers in charge of security in the East Wing found a set of moldy documents among old boxes of decommissioned ammunition. They were file folders dating from 1958, written in Russian, with confidential and experimental stamps. He took the material to Sergeant Hicks, who, with the help of a local translator, managed to understand the basics. The documents talked about an operation called Black Flame, a behavioral induction project based on biological and acoustic manipulation. The project, according to the records, had been shut down after a series of failed tests on political prisoners. The symptoms reported were identical to Travis's: immobile eyes, lack of sleep, language changes, and identity dissociation. The last experiment, carried out in a facility north of Minsk, ended with the disappearance of 2 of the scientists and the complete burning down of the testing wing. The recommendation at the end of the document was clear: never repeat in the open. The most disturbing thing was the signature at the bottom of the report. It was from the same Soviet officer present at the recent meetings at the base. When confronted, he just smiled and said, "The Soviet archives are always out of date. You never know what's true." This confirmed what many already suspected. Travis was not the victim of an accident. He was put into that exercise as part of something much bigger, something that had started long before them. On the night of February 2nd, American Major Donald Wilkins, responsible for the base's internal security, was found drunk, alone in the mess hall, crying over a bottle of smuggled vodka. 2 soldiers had to help him back to his quarters. On the way, he began to speak, low, slurred, but with frightening clarity. "I knew it. They warned me. That gas. It wasn't ours, nor theirs. It goes back a long way." Sent to the barracks, Wilkins continued to mumble disconnected phrases. "He's not stuck there anymore. He's stuck here. Oh," he said, pointing to his own head. The soldiers noted the behavior, but didn't know what to do. The next day, the major was removed from the base by a special team without the right to explanations. The official report claimed serious breach of discipline and mental breakdown. But the two soldiers who heard him swear to this day he was sane, just terrified. It was after this episode that orders began to change. What had previously been just containment became urgent containment. Communications between officers began to use terms like latent threat and potential risk of spread. Travis's behavior remained stable, and that was exactly what was most frightening. The fact that he showed no reaction at all was worse than any outburst of violence. In the early hours of February 10, 1968, the base was put on high alert. At 03:11, the monitors in room 14B stopped transmitting signals. Cameras went out. Sensors were unresponsive. For exactly 7 minutes, there was no record of what was happening inside. When power was restored, the containment capsule was empty. The door, locked by 3 levels of biometric security, remained intact. There were no signs of forced entry, no thermal trails. Travis had disappeared. The Polish commander ordered an immediate sweep of the base. Helicopters flew over the perimeter, sniffer dogs were deployed, and all exit routes were blocked. Nothing was found. It was as if Travis had evaporated into the concrete. Over the next 3 days, mass interrogations were conducted, and officials from all the countries involved were placed under constant surveillance. The presence of the Soviets increased abruptly, and diplomatic tensions almost exploded. On the evening of the 3rd day, one of the border guards, more than 12 kilometers from the base, was found unconscious at his post. His gun was still in its holster, and there were no signs of a struggle. In the pocket of his uniform, a note written in military graffiti read, "I am no longer alone." The handwriting was Travis. That was enough for the command to declare a state of maximum emergency containment. For the first time, they considered that Travis was no longer just a victim. He was a vector. Decades later, in 1997, a snippet of black and white video surfaced anonymously on obscure military internet forums. Less than 2 minutes long, it showed a man sitting in a metal chair, chained by the wrists. The room was dark, with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. His face was partially hidden, but some veterans said with absolute certainty that it was Travis Moore. His movements were slow, but his eyes were open, fixed on the camera. The most disturbing part came in the last few seconds. The image distorted briefly, and for a moment Travis's eyes appeared white, without pupils. A high-pitched, almost inaudible sound came from the background. Some users claimed that, after watching the video, they began to experience persistent insomnia and episodes of disorientation. The forums where the video appeared were mysteriously shut down a few days later. No one has ever been able to trace the origin of the original file. Some conspiracy theorists suggest that the video was leaked by a repentant former American officer. Others believe it was a purposeful message, as a test. But they all agree on one thing. The recording didn't look aged like others from the time. The resolution, the noises, even the interference patterns were different, as if they had been made with technology that simply shouldn't have existed in 1968. Unofficial records indicate that, in the following years, a series of unusual disappearances occurred in regions of Eastern Europe, all involving ex-military personnel, scientists, and intelligence agents. The patterns were almost invisible, except to those who knew what to look for. In many of these cases, a curious detail recurred. Witnesses reported seeing a quiet, dark-eyed man present shortly before the events. He was described as strangely quiet, too pale, or with a presence that bothered the skin. In 1981, a British intelligence agent undercover in East Berlin said in a confidential report that she had come across a man who appeared to be being followed by Soviet soldiers. He walked as if he didn't notice them. When she looked into his eyes, she froze. She didn't move for 3 whole minutes. Only after he disappeared into the crowd was she able to breathe normally. While reviewing photos taken that day, she found his face in the background of one of the pictures. It was Travis, aged but unmistakable. Since then, he has been referred to by some intelligence circles as a null entity, a codename used for phenomena that are beyond known human scope, but whose origin is documented. Travis Moore officially ceased to exist, but what he became has never been entirely erased. Nor could it be. In 1987, in a storage facility at the former American base in Stuttgart, West Germany, one of the presence sensors detected movement. The site had been decommissioned for over 10 years. When the security team arrived, they found only a chair in the center of the room, and on it, a rusty dog tag, Moore, Travis A. Next to it was a folded sheet of paper. It read, "I'm not coming back. I've just come to see how you're getting on." The document was forwarded directly to NATO's High Command. The facility was sealed and the soldiers involved in the find were relocated to remote posts in different parts of the world. None of them remained in the same place for more than 3 months. Silencing witnesses became a priority. The name Travis Moore circulated again in secret reports, always in reference to anomalies of non-replicable military origin. Global security experts came to the conclusion that Travis's mere presence posed a threat, not just biological or psychological, but symbolic. He was a living reminder that at some point in history, humanity crossed a line it shouldn't have crossed, and what came from the other side was still out there, watching. No one knows for sure what Travis became. Some theories suggest that he was taken over by a collective consciousness, perhaps something that came along with the gas, a parasitic presence. Others believe that he was transformed into a kind of receiver, picking up signals that go beyond our understanding of time and space. There are also those who say that Travis never left room 14B, and that everything seen afterwards was just manifestations of what was left of him. What is known is that since the 1967 incident, the protocol for chemical warfare tests has changed radically. Entire bases have been decommissioned. Documents have been destroyed. Officers have disappeared without a trace. Travis became a forbidden legend, mentioned only in confidential meetings, in hushed tones, as if even the sound of his name carried risk. Not for what he did, but for what he was, or what he became. And on the coldest nights, in some Eastern European forests, veteran soldiers swear they hear light footsteps, the distant sound of a respirator, and a presence that chills the bones. They say that if you stay in the dark too long, you'll feel eyes watching you, and that if you answer the call, you may not come back the way you were before, because Travis Moore never died. He just changed, and the world has never been the same since.